Rural and remote Australia is unique and differs greatly from urban Australia in terms of people, place, and culture. Practicing psychology in these settings calls for a similarly unique understanding and ethical approach, grounded in an appreciation of the distinct characteristics of rural and remote contexts. Rural and remote refers to all areas outside major cities. According to 2015 estimates, approximately 29% of Australia's population resides in rural and remote areas. Rural and remote Australia is hugely diverse. Communities vary in history, culture, population size, degree of isolation, and demographic makeup. They are, however, united by limited or non-existent access to mental health care services and other specialist services more generally. It has been suggested that there is a rural culture, a system of common beliefs and norms found within rural contexts. Evidence has been found for stoicism and a culture of self-reliance amongst rural people. Rural communities have been described as fishbowls, where everyone may know or know of everyone else, and there is little anonymity. People in these fishbowl-like communities perceive higher levels of social stigma about mental illness. Rural people are exposed to stresses such as unpredictable weather, drought, lack of leisure time, and farm accidents. Rural people are more likely to be unemployed, have lower income, and lower levels of education. There is also a higher proportion of Indigenous people in rural and remote areas. To work effectively within these populations, psychologists should, while avoiding stereotyping, develop an awareness of the characteristics of rural people and life. In order to understand the people and to gain trust and respect, psychologists new to small towns may go through a process of socio-cultural adaptation by engaging with the community. Cultivating this community connection can both help and hinder effective and ethical practice. Rural populations experience higher rates of mental health problems relative to their urban counterparts. These rates are similarly high amongst rural children and adolescents and even higher amongst rural Indigenous populations. Despite these higher rates of mental health problems in rural communities, there is a severe lack of access to comprehensive, immediate and permanent mental health care. In 2008, only 20.5% of psychologists worked in rural and remote regions. Mental health services in these regions tend to provide mainstream, generalist treatment approaches, usually outreaching from larger regional hubs. Accessing these services may mean clients must travel long distances, leaving their home, family, and work. The combined effect of the scarcity of specialist services, the social stigma around mental illness, and the lack of knowledge about the services a psychologist can provide significantly hinders people's capacity to seek help when it is needed. While all psychologists must abide by the Australian Psychological Society Code of Ethics, the unique socio-cultural characteristics of rural and remote settings places specific types of pressure on a psychologist's ability to practice effectively and ethically. This means ethical practice may look different in rural and remote settings compared to urban settings. The APS outlines 4 commonly confronted ethical issues for rural and remote psychologists. They are limits to competence, boundary management, confidentiality, and professional and personal isolation. The following exploration of these 4 ethical issues and a related case study will highlight the specificity of psychological practice in rural and remote settings, how this specificity is related to the incidence of ethical issues, and the ways in which these ethical challenges can be managed. An emphasis will be placed on the need for psychologists to understand rural settings and communities to practice successfully and ethically within them.
The APS Code of Ethics mandates that psychologists practice within the boundaries of their competence. The isolation of rural practice and the lack of diverse skilled service providers challenges a rural psychologist's ability to clearly define the boundaries of their competence. The lack of specialists and referral options places pressure on rural psychologists to be generalists. Although being a generalist allows a psychologist to connect with the community, they may find themselves in situations where their level of competence conflicts with their duty of care. A client may present with a problem beyond the psychologist's expertise, but there may be no other immediate or viable treatment alternatives. Psychologists in this dilemma must consider the implications of providing or not providing the service. The decision must be guided by the principle of non-maleficence and the standards of professional responsibility and informed consent. Deciding to make a referral may result in treatment delays, time spent away from work and family, and increased risk of harm to the client. If the psychologist decides to carry out the service themselves, they must inform the client of their limited competence. They must gain support and knowledge where possible, potentially through long-distance consultation with a specialist. This has the benefit of the client remaining at home, but also creates the risk that adequate treatment may not be received. Cultural competence is especially important for a rural psychologist as they often deal with a larger proportion of Indigenous clients who also suffer from higher rates of mental illness. Psychologists are advised to seek cross-cultural education and collaboration with Indigenous co-workers or community members as cultural ignorance may be detrimental to clients. These ethical challenges highlight the need for rural psychologists to be flexible, resourceful, and well-connected, not only within their community but also further afield. Rural psychologists need to have a high degree of self-awareness regarding their own abilities to prevent any possible adverse consequences to clients. They must be able to recognize and manage situations in which a client's needs exceed their competence. Rural psychologists must cultivate a meaningful understanding of the community, their clients, their experiences and cultures, and develop the ability to integrate this into ethical practice. The Code of Ethics requires that psychologists establish and maintain proper professional boundaries with clients and colleagues. However, the fishbowl paradigm of rural communities can challenge a psychologist's ability to maintain these clear boundaries. Psychologists may find themselves at the same community events or part of the same community organizations as their clients. There may only be one supermarket, bank, post office, or cafe in which one of their clients works. The APS guidelines recognize that overlapping relationships may be inevitable for rural psychologists and that they are not necessarily unethical. It is when these relationships impair objectivity, efficiency, and professional judgment or cause harm or exploitation that an ethical breach has occurred. As there may be no other treatment alternatives or referral options, rural psychologists must make judgments weighing the risk of a client not receiving any service versus engaging in a dual relationship. The psychologist must have a high degree of self-awareness to monitor these dual interactions to prevent them from becoming problematic. To manage these risks, the rural psychologist should have a plan in place for when boundary issues arise and carefully record their decision-making processes. At the outset of the professional relationship, the psychologist should discuss with the client the likelihood of out-of-therapy contact and what strategies the client would like to use should these situations arise. Throughout the duration of therapy, the psychologist should return to these issues and continue to empower the clients to make decisions about their own care. A psychologist may live away from where they practice, or they may limit or compartmentalize social interactions to balance professional and personal relationships. This compartmentalization, however, restricts opportunities for community engagement, potentially contributing to personal isolation, burnout, and limits to competence.
Confidentiality is foundational to a therapeutic relationship and successful treatment, as it ensures a client feels safe when disclosing their personal information. For this reason, the Code of Ethics mandates that psychologists follow the standards of confidentiality. While there are explicit limits to confidentiality outlined in the APS Code, rural practice places additional pressures on confidentiality. To gain trust and respect, a psychologist, especially if they're new to town, may become involved with the community. However, a consequence of this community engagement is a lack of anonymity and privacy. Psychologists may become part of the small town fishbowl paradigm. Hearing information about clients at the supermarket or from mutual connections is not uncommon in small communities, and psychologists must take this into consideration when explaining informed consent to their clients. In these settings, it is of extra importance to train clinic staff regarding confidentiality. Psychologists must also be mindful of how information learned outside of sessions may influence their practice, despite their best efforts to maintain objectivity. Due to the fishbowl paradigm of rural towns, confidentiality may be unintentionally breached.
For example, community members may be able to recognise a client's car near this clinic or may see a client walk into a clinic. In these instances, psychologists are unable to protect their client's anonymity. A psychologist needs to be aware that due to the stigma associated with mental illness, some individuals will not seek a psychological service for fear of being identified. This is highly problematic and difficult to manage with the limited resources available in rural towns. As many rural psychologists are typically the only one in the community, they can face professional and personal isolation. Most training and education for psychologists is based around an urban model. This model assumes that psychologists have a variety of professional resources and networks readily available to them. This may not translate to rural areas where psychologists do not have easy access to such resources. Due to isolation, rural psychologists can struggle with restricted access to ongoing professional supervision, education, training, and personal development. To access professional development, psychologists may have to travel to major cities, postponing usual work with local clients. Without continued development and supervision from other colleagues, rural psychologists are at increased risk of making ethical errors and continuing to make the same errors. Small rural communities can often treat psychologists as outsiders due to their higher level of education and perceived lack of understanding of the rural way of life. These community attitudes may potentially enhance feelings of personal isolation. High work demand, isolation, and inconsistent financial periods, for example, when clients may not have the means to pay for services due to things like drought, are all stresses experienced in rural practice. These stresses may result in burnout and compromise the psychologist's ability to deliver a competent and ethical service. It is important for rural psychologists to understand the realities of isolation and how it may impact their ability to meet professional standards and maintain a level of self-care. Psychologists should explore ways of connecting with the community, creating a social life, and utilising local networks for both professional and personal support.
We will now look at a case study to explore the ethical issues that have been discussed. Imagine you were a farmer battling against one of the worst droughts in history. What would the drought do to your livelihood? What would that mean for your family? How might this impact your well-being? Now imagine you are facing these challenges alone, far from neighbours and hours away from the nearest towns. This is the reality for many Australian farmers. This isolation, combined with the pressure of doubt, can contribute to mental illness. Should these individuals choose to seek help, they can face several barriers, such as distance, loss of finances, and social stigma. Don is a farmer who was living through the drought on the Murray-Darling Basin.
13 months ago, ribble was that bad, I could walk across it in patches in my bare feet and not even get my toenails wet. I'd come around and check the water and there'd be dead lambs, half dead lambs. You just didn't even want to look at it, that really just made you feel sick. But now, just doing the water itself, it probably only takes me about 15, 20 hours a week, So really, it leaves a lot of spare time, and I think that spare time was part to do with why I ended up going down the tube with depression, because, just chores have been done, and you get so much time to sit around and think and look and do nothing, And I got bad. I was pretty close to suicidal. Even though I didn't tell the doctor at first off, but yeah. And I just sort of sit there and I remember how good the garden that used to look, and I must get out and weed that or mow that lawn and things like that, and just, that's as far as I got, just sit there and look at it. I felt that there was nobody I could talk to. No doubt there was. I could have went and talked to the tree or pet sheep or something like that, but yeah, I just felt like there was nothing out here. And I just sort of just kept on going and going and going, and eventually I just said to myself one morning, I'm going to the doc. I didn't even ring the doctor up. I just drove straight in because I know what he's like. He's only a bush quack, but I got a fair bit of time for him. And I just said, I broke down actually. I just said, look, I need help. Point me in the right direction. And he actually transferred me across to Denton in New South Wales. And yeah, Pat, the counsellor I see there, well, actually I don't see him. I see him from time to time, mostly phone calls. Yeah, I like the bloke, and I feel comfortable with him. I can talk to him. Because of the distance and the road conditions, I don't see him as often as what I should, but I said mostly a phone call. But yeah, he keeps in touch and sees how I'm going and things like that. And he told me if, because they're not allowed to come on the dirt, if I'm really bad, he'd be prepared to jump in the car and meet me at the end of the bitumen. Just to pull up under a tree and have a chat, so.
When Don became depressed, he sought help from the local GP, who referred him to a psychologist in a city a few hours away. Due to the distance, financial burden, and Don's inability to leave his farm for any length of time, most of Don's sessions took place over the phone. The psychologist offered to travel to Don's property if he became severely distressed. From an urban perspective, it may seem inappropriate or unethical for a psychologist to travel to a client's home due to the possibility of breaching appropriate professional boundaries. However, for a rural psychologist, travelling to a client's home may be the only way for a client to receive the treatment they need. Here, the psychologist has made a judgment about the risks associated with Don receiving no treatment and has decided this outweighs the risks that ethical misconduct will occur through this service delivery. Don's case also highlights issues around psychologists exceeding competence and cultural understanding. As the psychologist is mainly providing services via distance, they may lack a meaningful understanding of Don's situation and lifestyle. To manage this, the psychologist must take on the additional responsibility of learning about and appreciating Don's wider cultural context, so it can be taken into consideration for effective treatment. This case demonstrates the complexities of ethical decision-making in a rural setting. It highlights that psychological services must be tailored to rural clients and settings due to contextual pressures, and that this tailoring means ethical practice may look different in a rural compared to an urban setting. An increasing number of psychologists are using e-therapy or behavioural e-health to provide services to rural clients. E-therapy provides psychological intervention through emails, chat rooms, online bulletin boards, interactive video, and video conferencing. E-therapy helps provide safeguards against certain ethical issues and is a convenient and cost-effective way for individuals in rural and remote communities to receive services. Some studies have found that people in rural communities are less likely to want face-to-face treatment and that computerized therapy relieved confidentiality concerns. Other studies have also suggested that computerized therapy can be as effective as face-to-face therapy within certain populations. E-therapy alleviates issues surrounding confidentiality and dual relationships as the psychologist is removed from the client's community. It can also enhance competence and alleviate professional isolation as rural psychologists can collaborate with specialists via distance. Although e-therapy cannot address all potential ethical issues, such as a lack of understanding of the realities of rural and remote life, it is an important tool in an evolving, connected health system that can reach many people that would otherwise lack mental health support. Specific ethical issues arise from psychologists working with rural and remote communities. Psychologists should ensure they have a clear understanding of themselves and their abilities. To manage ethical risks, they should have a solid model of ethical decision-making. They should ensure they have clear, informed consent from clients surrounding issues such as out-of-therapy contact, boundary management, and potential limits to competence. Keeping thorough notes documenting informed consent, out-of-therapy contact, and decision-making processes regarding treatment delivery is essential. Ensuring confidentiality is vital. This means training clinic staff and being highly aware and cautious when interacting with any community members. Working with rural and remote clients differs substantially from working with urban clients. Psychologists should develop a deep understanding of the specific stresses, people, beliefs, and norms that exist in these regions. They should have an awareness of the challenges of rural and remote settings and how this can shape what ethical practice looks like. Training and education in psychology should emphasize the importance of context and how it can impact many dimensions of psychological practice. Access to mental health services, such as e-therapy, should continue to be researched, validated, and improved to support people in rural and remote communities.